Okay. Um, well, I'm Dan, and this is Naomi, and we wanted to have a conversation about voter suppression in this election, and how direct voter contact, like the calls it Knock Democracy is making every week, can help fight against that. So we thought we'd have an expert on to talk about it, and we're delighted to be joined today by Professor Doug Spencer, who is a professor of election law at the University of Connecticut, and who has written widely about voter suppression and voting rights. So how's it going today, Doug? So happy to see you.
It's great to see you too, Dan and Naomi. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And I'll just add that Doug taught us everything we know about this issue. So that was why we thought of you.
Yeah, Doug was an outstanding professor when we had him last semester. Yeah. So I guess we'll just launch into a few questions that we had. So firstly, state laws that are designed to suppress votes, particularly voters of color, have a long history in the United States. And we were wondering, how relevant do you think that history is to the kind of voter suppression that's happening in this election that we're seeing?
I think the history is incredibly relevant. I think the Republican Party has tried to minimize that history when they talk about certain kinds of rules, voter ID laws or ballot checking, signature checking. They say, look, if you just take these laws in the abstract, they're very reasonable. We should be able to verify all of these different aspects of the process, except for the fact that the one big asterisk, these exact kinds of verification and anti-fraud rhetoric was built around all kinds of racist voter suppression for the last 50 to 60 years. So it's really difficult to say, you know what, let's just hit reset and pretend like that hasn't happened and pretend like what's going on now is just neutral, nonpartisan, anti-fraud regulation when all of that's been going on, not to mention the kind of dialogue that's going on among the candidates themselves. So not only is there a 50-year history, but the candidates themselves, particularly President Trump, has spoken in such racist language and tones that it just contributes to the fact that this is a continuation of something that's been going on for a long, long time.
Yeah, completely hear that. And I think I wanted to pick up on something you said. You mentioned voter fraud and how that's playing in. And I know that a lot of state voter suppression laws are justified by reference to the threat to the integrity of our elections that voter fraud poses. And I was wondering if you would just talk a little bit about how real you think that threat is, and whether voter fraud is an actual threat to our elections.
So the short answer is no. I don't think voter fraud is a threat to the elections. I think the best way to really see that in practice is politicians can say whatever they want. Twitter is open to anybody to say whatever they want. But when these candidates appear before judges, because there are challenges to these laws, and the lawyers and the candidates say, well, it's because of fraud, and a judge says, well, show me the evidence. They're just unable to provide evidence in case after case after case. In Montana, there was a claim that counties were able to use mail-in ballots if they chose to, and Republicans challenged that and said that's going to lead to fraud. And the judge in that case asked a very prominent Republican attorney, can you provide me any evidence of fraud, voter fraud, in Montana in the last 20 years that would justify us being skeptical? And the lawyer just said, no. He was like really honest. And so that's happened over and over. And as you see in these trial courts, and the trial courts is where evidence has to be shown. Time and time again, judges have said, you're not providing evidence. We cannot use that as a justification for passing these laws or challenging these laws. Voter fraud itself is just so minimal. Voters are not engaged in fraudulent activities. There might be fraudulent activities or interference from foreign governments. There might be fraudulent activities from poll workers who may not be following all of the rules. That's not voter fraud. Voter fraud is behaviors that voters engage in. It's just not happening. The cases that we know about that amount to maybe a few dozen cases over 20 or 30 years is just basically nil.
Good to know. Yeah, I guess on that front, what are the laws that you see as kind of meant to address that fraud? And which kind of state laws do you think are the most going to cause the biggest impediments in this presidential election?
Well, the motivation for the laws is one thing, which I do think that they're motivated by partisan concerns and racial concerns. But I think that how it actually plays out in practice has a lot to do with timing. So I think the states where we should be the most worried about any kind of these activities are the states that have handcuffed themselves to these very, very short time periods where they have to go about engaging in ballot review and looking at signatures. And so I think number one on that list is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has refused to allow its poll workers to just look at the signatures on the ballots of their absentee ballots before election day. Don't open the envelopes, don't look at the ballots, don't run them through the machine. Just do one step of the process, a time-consuming step. You need to check that the signatures match and that there's no stray marks, etc. Because poll workers are not allowed to do that in Pennsylvania, that simple task will run up against a deadline on the back end. That's where I'm the most concerned about a state that supposedly is worried about fraud, but not giving themselves enough time to actually go about auditing whether there's been some kind of fraud or something wrong. And so they're putting themselves in a position to end up contributing to a chaos after the election.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such an alarming problem and it's so worrying. And you know, I don't know if you have any thoughts as to how direct voter contact might be a useful way of combating against that, because obviously the reason that we want to do this is so that, you know, we can talk about this in the context of the Knock for Democracy community, so that people know what's going on, and so that our volunteers have this information to share with voters. Because, you know, I think at this point in the election process, a lot of what we're doing with our calls is talking to voters in states like Pennsylvania about like how to make sure that they cast their ballot on time and that their vote is counted. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts as to how, you know, those kinds of phone calls and direct voter contact can help mitigate the effects of these kinds of voter suppression laws.
Absolutely. I can think of three things. I'll try to be quick. Number one, if you look at the political science literature, it's very clear that personal contact is the number one driver of getting people out to vote. Usually we rely on campaigns to do that, and the campaigns have raised a lot of money, but they're spending most of their money on TV ads, and because of the pandemic, they're not really able to go door to door and canvass in the way that they used to, which is the most powerful way to motivate and mobilize voters. Number one. So any contact that you can make with a voter personally, not a robocall, not a mailer, on the phone, hi, my name's Dan, I want to encourage you to vote. That has a big, big effect. We know that's been shown over and over in political science literature. So that's the first thing. The second thing and the third thing are to look at the reasons why mail-in and absentee ballots have been rejected. And the two primary reasons are, one, they're sent in too late, or two, there's something wrong with their signature. Both of those can be fixed if you have somebody on the phone to answer questions or to provide guidance about the rules beforehand. In Pennsylvania, you have to put your ballot in an envelope and you have to put the envelope in an envelope. Well, some people may not realize that, but someone on the phone who calls and says, don't forget to put your naked ballot in this envelope can have a huge impact on preventing votes from ultimately being rejected. So just as a general matter, contacting people is going to turn them out. But speaking specifically to the issues at play in this election, helping people understand the deadlines that are arising and the need to vote quickly and soon, and how to sign and fill out the envelopes would be a huge service, would make a big, big difference.
That's great.
Yeah.
One other question I'll just tack on to that too. A lot of voter suppression is about misinformation. Is there anything in particular that you think is circling out there that you would want to dispel, or what do you think is the most important thing to clear up?
You know, I'm less worried right now about misinformation because of some stories that have been in the news the last couple of days. And those stories suggest that not foreign people, but foreign governments have been able to get access to some of our voter records. And the reason why that concerns me is because I think that the goal is to use these stories and to use this voter data to create confusion on election day and in the few days afterwards when we might not know who's voted. So what I see from that kind of a story coming out is the need to vote early has become ever more important, whether it's in-person early voting or mailing your ballot in sooner. The larger percentage of overall votes that have already been delivered by election day will change the trajectory of this entire race. If a majority of ballots have already been cast before the election day, then anybody who's trying to say, well, we may not know the results and muddy it up will have a much harder time because the results will be much more known and secure. That's the number one concern that I have right now, more than disinformation. I think disinformation will start to circulate very rapidly. If you look at 2016, the amount of things that happened in the last 12 days of an election, FBI Director Comey made a statement and then it just spiraled out of control. A lot can happen, and I'm sure Facebook will be blowing up. It's hard to foresee what will come out. But I would instead be more concerned about delivering a ballot soon so that this disinformation has no impact on people's minds.
I think we were also thinking that, one of the worries is that if the election is close and the results can't be determined on election night, that's exactly, when a lot of problems can begin and the president can begin to sow chaos. And I think a lot of people are looking around and seeing that Biden is up big in the polls and feeling a little bit complacent about what we need to do right now. And, just to reiterate how important it is not just that we win, but that we win in a convincing way that makes clear on election night or shortly thereafter that this election has been decided and has been decided conclusively.
100%. The higher the turnout, the more legitimate the results will be. And not just legitimate because we believe them, but legitimate because the outcome will reflect the actual will of the American people. And we know from surveys and from voting in other elections that the American electorate actually supports Democratic policies more than Republican policies at this moment in time. So if our government doesn't reflect that, that's a product of some procedural issues or low turnout. And I think that anybody who's complacent about, Biden's up 7 points in Pennsylvania, Biden's up 10 points in North Carolina, Biden's up X anywhere. You don't have to look very far back to find that complacency made a huge difference in America. People stayed home in 2016 because it was just a given Hillary Clinton would win that election. And Hillary Clinton did not win that election at the end of the day. And our country is so much different because of that complacency. So I'm hopeful that people who sat out in 2016 will realize that was a really, really dumb choice and they'll have their voice be heard. Either way, but I think particularly for Democrats who looked at polls and said, it's a given. That can't happen again, but it requires people to come and cast their ballots.
Cast their ballots, and then once they've cast their ballots, volunteer with Knock for Democracy.
Volunteer and talk to your neighbors. As I said earlier, the number one way to get people to the polls is to talk to them. You don't have to drive them there. You don't have to tell them who to vote for. You need to encourage them to vote, period, and maybe help them understand the rules. That will get more people to the polls than any other intervention. That's been shown to be more powerful than phone calls, television ads, radio ads. You call and talk to somebody. It's the number one way to get people out. And so I think what volunteers doing at KFD are amazing. I think that what the impact that this campaign will have of calling people will be huge. It's not small. It's not a waste of your time. It's not going to make a difference of 0.5 percentage point. It's going to make a difference in the actual outcome of the election. And so I encourage you to call as many people as you can.
Thank you so much, Doug. We really appreciate that. That was amazing.